Я ухожу.
И в сортире их замочат, в конце концов.
Свобода лучше, чем не свобода.
Крым и Севастополь возвращаются в родную гавань.
Welcome to Infocom. In the new episode of Focus on Russia, our guest is journalist Neil Hauer. Neil, welcome back to our studio and thank you for your time.
Great, thanks for having me back.
Neil, I would like to talk about the war in Ukraine because you're one of the few people who were actually in Ukraine during the Russian invasion. So what were your first thoughts when you learned about the Russian attack? What was the atmosphere in Kiev, I guess? You were in Kiev or somewhere else. Could you explain the atmosphere of the first few days of the war?
Yeah, I mean, it was sort of a funny thing. I was in Ukraine. I went at the end of January from here, having a thought that something would happen, watching all the troop movements and everything. And then, throughout February, the mood in Ukraine and in Kiev was really either, oh, nothing will happen at all. It's just sort of, media hype, or, it just, this is the Russians playing some games. Or if something does happen, it'll be something, just limited in the East. And then I think that only finally started to change on the Monday, 3 days before the war, when Putin gave his speech on Ukraine. The whole went through all his reasons for why Ukraine's a fake country, et cetera, and ended with recognizing DNR, LNR. And that's when people realized that, this isn't normal. And then it was especially, the day before, the Wednesday, it was really, you could sense the tension as people started to realize, something. The Russians had already gone into DNR, LNR territory, and that you could sense that something bigger was coming. But even then, there's still plenty of people who were, I think definitely the majority of people were shocked to wake up, as we did, at basically 5 a.m. in Kiev on the 24th with cruise missile strikes. And the mood then was just sort of, people were just sort of in shock the first few days. I mean, there wasn't much outright panic, I didn't see much of people breaking down in the streets or anything like that, but everyone was just sort of shell-shocked and getting through it, because this was, people really thought that, and I think most people worldwide thought that the Russians Putin would never be crazy enough to do the full-scale invasion. So when it did happen, it was definitely a big shock.
Yeah, and how would you describe the change in the attitude, in the atmosphere throughout the month you spent in Ukraine? So I guess the first few days, as you already mentioned, were quite messy. So what happened next?
Yeah, I mean, the first couple of days, it really was moving fast. I mean, the first day we were in, Kiev on the 24th, and then, spent the overnight into the 25th entirely in the shelter. And that's when, on the 25th, there were already, Russian Spetsnaz, other special forces in Kiev trying to capture or kill Zelensky. We were you could hear the street battles from downtown Kiev. And so that really added this sense that, wow, things are moving fast. They're already in Kiev on day 2. And it got to the point where, initially me and my colleagues I was there with had planned to stick around in Kiev for the first week and then, move on out of there. And by the end of the second day, we were thinking, we better get out tomorrow, because we don't want to be in a situation where we're stuck in Kiev and it's encircled. We thought to ourselves, well, we really wish we'd gotten out earlier. And there was really this sense at that point, the first couple days, that the Russians were moving fast, that Kiev was going to be encircled within a couple of days. And then that really, over the next week or two, that momentum really started to lay off. I mean, the Russians moved in west of Kiev, and they started moving in from the east as well. But the offensive just really stalled out and hit the point where a week after that, about the 10th day of the war, already we were all in Lviv, and my colleague actually went back to Kiev just on the train. And it was just a massive change from a week beforehand, where it had been everyone fleeing. Well, they still could get out of Kiev, and then moving to that point where it looks like the defenses were going to hold. And then after around that time, over the next week after that, it really settled in this sense that the battle lines, at least around Kiev, really stagnated. And in other areas of the country, the Russian advance, even in the south where it was the fastest, really started to slow down. And so after, I would say, like the first 2, maybe 3 weeks, it really sort of started that sense of the full-scale panic, like, oh, this might go really quickly, slowed down as we saw how prepared the Ukrainians were and how effective they were in their defense.
So Neil, you have already covered 2 wars, the Second Karabakh War and the Russia-Ukrainian War. Could you talk about some similarities and differences in these 2 wars?
Yeah, I guess the biggest difference that I was always thinking about was that just the scale of the two places involved. I mean, Karabakh being, small place, and especially when we were there in mid-October 2020, and you really did have that sense like everything is a target at any possible time with the Bayraktars operating overhead, and you would drive past vehicles that had been struck by them, and then you were never far away from artillery fire or anything, with Karabakh being the size that it is, whereas Ukraine is just a vast country, and it's the scale of the fighting there. Well, it's huge objectively. It's the biggest land war in Europe since World War II. But the size of Ukraine is such that unless you're in a few select places, the danger is never that close. But at the same time too, because of that scale, I think it really took. It wasn't until a month into my trip where I felt like I'd seen something that was like the same scale of destruction as in Karabakh. That was always the pinnacle of that for me was always Martuni in mid-October 2020, which was in terrible shape. And it wasn't until we got to Kharkiv about 3 weeks ago that we saw something similar in Ukraine, where Kharkiv was, a city of almost 2 million people, and almost every street north of the center just bombed. And so that scale of it contributed to it as well. Just the fact that Karabakh is so much more concentrated, and the destruction becomes that much more evident versus Ukraine, where it is just so much larger.
So moving forward with these parallels between the 2 wars, I would like to ask you a question about ramifications of the international response to the Second Karabakh War for the war in Ukraine. So, a renowned military analyst, Robley, who has become well known during his coverage of the Second Karabakh War and the war in Ukraine, tweeted a while ago that the Second Karabakh War showed that a country could capture territories through military force with a minimal international response, and that he implied that it was a great incentive for Putin and for the decision makers in Russia to actually start the war. So what is your take on this comment?
I mean, I struggle to think how that wouldn't have been a factor. You look at how that played out for Azerbaijan, and even though they're operating in the more favorable, let's say, perception environment of it being a disputed territory, or territory that is internationally recognized to some degree, or at least shows up on maps, on detailed maps as Azerbaijan, that contributes to it as well. But at the same time, this is one of the observations I had a number of times, as people were. I think a lot of people were shocked, thinking that just large, full-scale state-on-state wars are something that don't happen anymore, and that's why they thought that the Russian invasion of Ukraine was so unthinkable. And if you were paying attention, there was a full-scale state-on-state war not too far away, just a year and a half ago. So, and definitely, I think the fact that the response to this was nothing more than some statements and maybe a little rhetorical slap on the wrist or two, but essentially no downsides for Azerbaijan from the international community writ large, let's say, I'm sure played a role in Putin getting overconfident, thinking that, okay, maybe I can do something more this time than just the sort of salami tactics or limited interventions like in Donbass or Crimea. Maybe I can go for something bigger this time. And I think it makes once you look at it through that framework, there's a lot of facts that line up with that.
Yeah, so continuing talking about the link between the 2 wars, I think one of the things we've been noticing in the last 2 or 3 months is the attempt by the Azerbaijani propaganda to drag Armenia into the Ukrainian war. So we've seen all these fake news about, I don't know, Armenian fighters being sent to Ukraine, and I don't know, even fighters from Nagorno-Karabakh being sent to Ukraine and that sort of stuff. So it's not unusual that the Azerbaijani side tries to use this international environment to, I don't know, to play with the image of Armenia. But why do high-ranking Ukrainian officials are actually buying these arguments and using these arguments? Do you think they are just trying to use any sort of argument which portrays Russia's weakness? Or what is the reason of their behavior? People like the Secretary of the Security Council who are like sharing all these false narratives and false stories.
I think it's to be honest, I think it's more of a case of Hanlon's razor. You know, never attribute to malice what can be explained by ignorance. Is that I just get the sense, you know, especially talking to people in Ukraine or even well-informed people in Ukraine, is that, you know, the knowledge of the Karabakh conflict or even what the second war here is extremely limited. I mean, people are broadly aware that there was a war between Armenia and Azerbaijan a year and a half ago, but not much more than that. And I think very few people, including, you know, top officials in Ukraine, have any real understanding of the complexities and the realities of the Armenia-Azerbaijan conflict itself. And and so of course this makes it fertile ground for Azerbaijani figures and pro-Azerbaijan lobbyists to try and take this line of, oh, look, Armenia is a Russian vassal state, so it's just another puppet of Moscow. And especially, look, Artsakh or Karabakh is just the same thing as DNR, LNR. It's just another Russian-backed fake puppet state that's only used to advance Russian imperialism. And so, of course, there's very few people out there, very few groups right now that aren't trying to utilize the Russia-Ukraine war for some sort of to twist it and to use it for portraying some of their own goals and projecting their own view of their own political goals onto it. And for this, you know, it's just so easy for Azerbaijanis to say, Azerbaijani officials to say, oh, look, we're doing the same thing as Armenia, as Ukraine is. We're just trying to take back our territory from illegal Russian occupation. And look, Armenia is going and helping them because Armenia is, you know, this helpless, godless little Russian puppet state. And it's exactly the sort of thing that you know, you would be almost expected, I think, to try and use a major crisis like this where everyone is watching it and try and put your own spin on it.
So you were even targeted by one of these pro-Azeri lobbies while being in Kharkiv, right?
Oh yeah, a number of them. Actually, another well-known lobbyist, Azerbaijani lobbyist in DC, had the goal to send a message to one of my editors while I was in Kharkiv saying, Neil, he's a problematic guy, you shouldn't be publishing him. To which my editor responded kindly, you know, Russian warship. Go. Yeah. And no, it never really stops with these people. And yeah, of course, there was the Ukrainian lobbyist as well. Taras Kuzio openly posted.
Yeah, I was talking about that guy who is like very actively pro-Azerbaijani.
Yeah, who has really been an interesting figure the last couple of years. You know, he went from being a full-scale Poroshenko lobbyist, and then, you know, around 2020, I guess, shifted to being just the classic sort of Azerbaijan national interest columns every month about how Azerbaijan is 100% right, and
the Ganja Gap.
The Ganja Gap, exactly, everyone's favorite. This sort of stuff, and how, you know, everyone who doesn't agree with that is a Russian agent. So it is kind of funny how, you know, just how brazen and transparent these people are. I mean, like, it's hard to. It would take an amazing amount of mental gymnastics to believe these people have just suddenly had this amazing change of heart where they think, the Ganja Gap has suddenly become their new, their life's main purpose, to defend that, just on the basis of their own personal ambitions alone.
Yeah, that's problematic indeed, and it's really strange that there are still people who take these lobbyists seriously. And summing up our conversation, I would like to talk about the future of this war. Do you see the end of this war? Is it gonna last for months, for weeks, or probably for years?
I mean, it's an interesting question in that it feels like, it could go on forever. But then I saw as well another, I think it was about either Rob Lee or Michael Kaufman, another really good Russia military analyst, saying that, this war, the scale of and the rate of the casualties that Russia's taking and the equipment losses and everything does not lend itself to more than, a couple more months of fighting at this intensity. Like they literally cannot sustain the rate of losses that they're taking. So, I mean, a lot of people like to point at May 9th, of course, Victory Day, the parade there, as something that Putin will want to have something done by. But I don't think it's I think that the Russians would like to accomplish something by then, but by no means is that going to be the end, because we're still at the point where the Russians, and Putin especially, feel like they really have to accomplish something. They have to get something out of everything that they've gained, everything that they've spent on this war, all the sunk costs, and basically Russia's economy now just being ravaged for what's going to be years. And they're not there yet. I mean, even if they do move in and take Slovyansk and Kramatorsk in Donbass, is that really good enough for them? Is that really worth, spending basically half the strength of their armed forces being brought down to inoperable for that? And I'm not sure. And at the same time, obviously, Ukraine will not accept anything other than the Russians returning to their February 23rd pre-war lines. I mean, the Ukrainians won't accept the Russians just sitting and occupying Kherson, for example, or Mariupol. So it becomes really hard to see. I think this is going to be, it's really a question of the Russians and the Russian will and ability to continue fighting. I think that's going to determine when this conflict winds down, but it won't be anytime soon.
Yeah, but let's hope that it will end soon, because this war has had very serious repercussions. First of all, for the people of the Ukraine, for the civilian population of the Ukraine, and for our region as well, because we're also living in a situation of chaos every day. Neil, thank you for a very interesting conversation.
Thanks for having me again.